You were the test run, not the favorite, not the mistake, the experiment, the one your parents practiced on before they figured out what they were doing. And if you were born first in a Gen X household, somewhere between 1965 and 1980, you didn't just grow up ahead of your siblings, you grew up in a completely different world than them. Same house, same parents, different rules, different expectations, different version of childhood altogether. I'm Frank, and if you're a firstborn Gen X, this one's going to hit a few nerves. I'm not telling you something you don't know. I'm saying out loud the stuff you've been carrying for 40-some years and never put a name on. Let's start with something that sounds obvious, but nobody talks about enough. When you were born, your parents had no other children. That means the only role models you had were adults. You didn't have an older brother showing you how to ride a bike wrong, or an older sister teaching you which teachers to avoid. Your whole frame of reference was grown folks. You watched them, you mimicked them, you absorbed the way they talked, how they handled problems, what they did when they were stressed. And because of that, you were already a little different from day one. Your younger siblings, they had you, and you were a kid. So their role models were a mix of adult behavior filtered through a child who was figuring it out in real time. Neither version was better or worse. They were just different roads through the same neighborhood. But it meant that by the time you were 7 or 8, you probably already sounded a little older than your age. You felt more comfortable around adults than around kids your own age. Teachers might have called you mature. Other kids might have called you something else. Now layer that on top of the Gen X experience. Your parents were likely boomers or late silents. Many of them were navigating divorce. The rates shot up from about 0.28% during the boomer childhood years to roughly 0.5% by the mid-1980s. That's an entire cultural shift happening inside your living room. Both parents working became normal, and for the firstborn in that house, something shifted that nobody discussed at the kitchen table. You became the backup plan. Not officially. Nobody sat you down and said, "Hey, you're 9, you're in charge now." It just happened. Your parents left for work, you were the oldest. The math was simple. And because this was the 70s and 80s, nobody was calling Child Protective Services over a 10-year-old managing the afternoon. That was just life. But here's where it gets interesting, and where the firstborn experience splits hard from the younger siblings. You didn't just handle the house, you handled everything outside of it differently too. Because the weight you carried at home followed you into every other space you walked into. At school, you were probably one of those kids who gravitated towards structure. Research on birth order consistently shows firstborns are drawn to leadership roles: class president, team captain, the kid who volunteered to collect the papers. A 2015 study out of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign that looked at 377,000 high school students found that firstborns tended to be slightly more conscientious, more extroverted, and more willing to lead than their younger siblings. The effect wasn't enormous, but it was consistent. And if you lived it, you know it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like an assignment that was never formally given. You raised your hand first because something in your wiring said, "If I don't do this, it doesn't get done." Confidence had nothing to do with it. That was conditioning. And it bled into everything. Group projects, sports teams, friend groups. You were the one making the plans. You were the one people defaulted to when decisions needed to happen. Meanwhile, your younger siblings? They were figuring out the same world with a completely different instruction manual. They had you as a buffer. They watched what happened when you made a mistake and adjusted. Parents who were strict with you loosened up with them, partly because they were tired, partly because they learned through trial and error. First-time parents tend to be more rigid and more anxious. By the second or third kid, the playbook relaxes. So while you were walking a tightrope at school, trying to meet expectations that were never clearly stated, your younger brother was doing the bare minimum and getting the same praise you had to earn. And here's the part that's going to sting a little. You noticed. You always noticed. But you didn't say anything, because firstborns don't complain. That's not in the code. The code says, handle it, keep moving, don't make it anybody's problem. And that code didn't come from a poster on a classroom wall. It came from years of being the one who was expected to hold it together. Outside the house, in the neighborhood, on the basketball court, at the roller rink, you carried yourself like a little adult. You'd been rehearsing it since before you could spell the word responsibility. While other kids were learning how to be kids from their older siblings, you were already running your own internal program. You were scanning for problems, reading the room, figuring out who needed what. That's a manager's skill set showing up in a 10-year-old, and you developed it on an empty stomach after school while your parents were still on the clock. Researchers have a word for what was happening to a lot of firstborn Gen X kids: parentification. It's when a child takes on the emotional or practical duties of a parent before they're ready. And it doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as a 12-year-old making sure dinner's on the table, or a teenager mediating a fight between their younger siblings because nobody else is home, or a kid who stops bringing their own problems to their parents because the household is already full of enough problems. The long-term effects are real. Adults who were parentified as children tend to lean hard into perfectionism. They have a deep, almost physical discomfort with things being out of order. They struggle to ask for help. The idea of needing someone else feels like a system failure, and stubbornness has nothing to do with it. They overprepare, they overfunction. They walk into a room and mentally start organizing it before they even sit down. If that sounds familiar, you're looking at a survival response that took root when you were still losing baby teeth. And somewhere along the way, it just became your personality. And that survival response didn't stay at home. It shaped your friendships, your career, your relationships, everything. Firstborns tend to end up in occupations requiring leadership, conscientiousness, and emotional stability. Data from Norwegian and Swedish military studies published through the National Bureau of Economic Research found that firstborns were significantly more likely to work as top managers. Later-born children? More likely to be self-employed, more willing to take risks, more comfortable switching jobs. Two different childhoods producing two different operating systems. Think about your friend group in high school. If you were the firstborn, there's a good chance you were the planner, the one who knew where everybody was going Friday night, the one who broke up the fights before they got stupid. You might have been the one driving before you had a license, because somebody had to get people home safe. You weren't the wild one. You were the anchor. And sometimes that felt good. But sometimes it felt like nobody ever asked if you wanted to be the anchor. They just assumed. Your younger siblings, on the other hand, had a completely different social experience. Later-borns grow up with peer-like role models, you. So by the time they hit the playground, the lunchroom, they already understood kid politics in a way you had to learn the hard way. They knew how to negotiate, how to be flexible, how to read the room from the bottom up instead of the top down. Some studies describe them as more socially adaptive, more open to new experiences, more comfortable going with the flow. They had different training data. Same family, different classroom. Here's something that rarely gets talked about: the romantic lives of firstborns. If you're a firstborn Gen X who dated in the 80s and 90s, you probably brought your whole management style into the relationship. Not on purpose, but you were the one making the plans. You were the one who felt responsible for the other person's feelings. You were the one who would rather fix a problem yourself than talk about it. A lifetime of handling things alone had taught you that's how you prove your worth, and the people around you were happy to let you keep proving it. And that training came with a cost, because while you were out there making sure everyone else was good, at home, at school, at the job, in the relationship, something else was happening that nobody warned you about. You were quietly running out of gas. Firstborns burn out differently. They don't collapse loudly, they just get quieter. They pull back. They start saying no to things they used to say yes to, and they can't explain why. One day you're the person who holds everything together, and the next day you're sitting in your car in a parking lot for 20 minutes because you just need silence before you go inside and be on again. Call it whatever you want. That's the bill coming due for decades of being the one who carried it. And the part that gets a lot of firstborns, most of them don't even realize they've been carrying anything. When you start that early, the weight feels normal. It's everyone else who seems light. Now, one more thing that needs to be said. The research on birth order is real, but it comes with a caveat. A major study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015, combined large data sets from 3 national panels, the UK, the US, and Germany, and found that while firstborns scored slightly higher on intelligence and self-reported intellect, there were no consistent birth order effects on the Big 5 personality traits: extroversion, emotional stability, agreeableness, conscientiousness, or openness. The biggest effects researchers found were about 1/10 of a standard deviation. That's small enough that nobody in your life could actually detect it just from talking to you. So what does that mean? It means the differences between firstborns and laterborns are written into experience, not DNA. The late 70s and 80s created a particular kind of firstborn, one who grew up in a world with less supervision, more responsibility, and fewer safety nets than any generation that came after. A 2023 paper led by psychologist Peter Gray at Boston College pulled together decades of evidence and concluded that the steady decline in children's independent activities since the 1960s is a major factor in rising youth mental health problems. The world wasn't any safer back then, but the freedom they had, and in your case, the responsibilities stacked on top of it, built something researchers call an internal locus of control, a belief that you can handle what's coming. And if you're a firstborn Gen X, that belief isn't theoretical. You've been proving it since you were old enough to reach the stove. The difference between you and your younger siblings isn't that you're better or they had it easier. It's that you got a different version of the same childhood. You were the rough draft, they were the revision. And somewhere in your 40s or 50s, you might have started realizing that the kid who held everything together is still running the show inside the adult who can't stop holding everything together. Worth noticing, even if it doesn't feel like a problem yet, because the thing about being the first is that nobody ever tells you when it's okay to stop going first. And maybe, just maybe, you've earned the right to let somebody else carry it for a while. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.